go ahead and get started. Go ahead and get started. So we just came from an incredibly stimulating and thought-provoking panel and paper. We are now going to go into our afternoon sessions. This panel is called Internationalism and Anti-imperialism, and it features Dr. Shelby Lewis of the African Renaissance and Diaspora Network Board, co-chair of the Council of National Conference of Black Political Scientists Presidents, and the director of the African Heritage Studies Association Institute. Dr. Cynthia Young, a visiting associate professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico. And may I make the announcement, or do you want to do it yourself? And also the incoming director of, I can't remember the title of
African American Studies at Penn State.
At Penn State. Great. Look who you just had lunch with. Dr. Gladys Mitchel-Walthour, a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Africology at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Dr. Kathy Stromile-Golden, associate vice president of academic affairs, professor of political science, director of international programs at Mississippi State Valley University. And myself. So please go right ahead, Dr. Lewis.
I'm starting. Thank you very much, Tiffany. Over many decades, I've learned a lot of lessons. And one of the lessons is there's always more to learn. And at this conference, this space, this time has given me the opportunity to learn many new things from all of you. I want to thank Tiffany, Nicole, and the university for inviting me and letting me participate in this great event. Now, I'm told it wasn't planned, but I believe it must have been in somebody's plan for somebody to come and sing my favorite song today. Ulapi, no, she's not a G, it's Wulapi. Wulapi sang "A Change Is Gonna Come." There have only been two other times, I'm claiming she sang it for me, two other times that this song was used. About 10 years ago, the National Conference of Black Political Scientists had a luncheon in my honor, and my son put together a video of family pictures in all parts of the world, and throughout, Sam Cooke's "A Change Is Gonna Come" was playing. And last year, in August, and Tiffany was there, for my 75th birthday, my son and daughter put together another video, "A Change Is Gonna Come" by Sam Cooke. And then the woman herself came today and sang my song. Thank you very much. I want to talk about some of my research, but I want to frame it in the context of my perspective on imperialism. I'll begin, as others have, just a little bit of my educational history and where I come from. I come from the great metropolis of Plain Dealing, Louisiana. In fact, we live outside of Plain Dealing. Grew up. Kathy Golden is from the same hometown, and I remember when she was born. But at any rate, large family, very supportive. We were 3 daughters and then 4 sons, and we were in charge of the boys. So I never feared that the males were going to be in control. We were older and we were in charge. And then I went to what started out as plain dealing colored high school. And that school started in 1953. It was the first high school in that area. When my mother and father went to high school, they had to go to another area and board. So it was the first one in that area. I started out in a two-room school, but that particular high school, and these were all segregated, there was the plain dealing high school, didn't have white on it, but that's always assumed there, and ours was the colored high school. But fortunately, people changed it to the name of a great educator, to Carrie Martin High School. And as happened in many places, when integration came, they made the black high school the elementary school, and the white high school became the elementary school. Became the high school. But the alumni of Carrie Martin High School made certain that they did not change it to plain dealing elementary school. It is today Carrie Martin High School. And we have reunions. We were too small to have class reunions. We had school reunions, and we still have them. I remember there were 34 in my class. Now, so I graduated from Carrie Martin High School at the age of 16. I was valedictorian of the class. I went to Southern University, majored in political science, and graduated at 19. And Jewel Lamar Prestige I met, who took me under her wing. You all have heard about Jewel Lamar Prestige. Now, Jewel tells this story that is meant to make people think that she came to Southern because of me. She did come to Southern immediately after I came, but she was working at Prairie View, and she said that the chairman of the department called her and said, "Jewel, there's a young girl here that reminds us of you. Why don't you come here and take her under your wings?" And Jewel said she came and she saw me and decided she did not want to take me under her wing because she did not want her wing broken. It was not, she didn't have to take me under her wings because she became the wind beneath my wings and helped me fly and move forward. So she is my mentor, and she influenced me a lot. I left Southern University and went to the University of Massachusetts, and that school was chosen simply because there were the student demonstrations, and there was doubt about the university staying open so that we would graduate. And that, the chair of the political science department at UMass sent a note, called me and said, if the school closes, you come anyway. Now, it could have been because he was very, very concerned about what was going to happen to me. But I think it was mostly because I had a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, and so he knew I had money, and the university got paid there. But anyway, I went to the University of Massachusetts, and I froze. But while I was at Southern, I went to a student meeting in Illinois, and the Student Association of Cuba invited us to come to Cuba, and several of us got selected. And that was my first international experience. It was very, very interesting. This was before America started, this was 1959, before America started the boycott and all the rest of Cuba. And we had a wonderful time when we went there. So think about me from plain dealing going to Cuba and having my mind open to other parts of the world. And then I go to the University of Massachusetts. And the year I was finishing up all the coursework for my doctorate, I was 21 and I decided to take this course in African politics that was taught by Gwendolyn Carter, one of the foremost specialists in African politics. In those days, all of the specialists in African politics were white, mostly male, but she was a female. But this woman said in class one day, well, you know, if African Americans go to Africa, they won't be accepted the same way as white Americans. And you know, we didn't say that in that day, but what? I couldn't believe that. That was just absolutely mind-blowing that someone would say that. I just couldn't believe it. So immediately, much to Jewel's dismay, I stopped, joined a program that Columbia University had, Teachers for East Africa, so I was going to see. And she said, well, Shelby, you just have one more year to get your doctorate. Why don't you stay? I said, I have got to go. I can't let this stand. So I went, and I was placed in Uganda. Now, the first day I was there, I was embraced by African students. Then I went to see the headmaster, who was a canon of the Anglican Church, and he was Canon Bottomley. And he said to one of the other faculty members, well, after all, she's a Negro. And I said, okay, I know who isn't going to be accepting, but all of the Africans were accepting. And I've got friends that I made there that we're still in touch with. I was embraced, there's no doubt about it. And then I've gone to at least 45, maybe more African countries and Asian countries and Latin American and Caribbean countries, and that's always been the case. I don't doubt that I will be accepted, probably more than a white American. And so I was happy. But of course, after I came back, I was 2 years at a school. Then I went to another school, Tororo Girls School. And so I was 4 years in Uganda. And when I got back, Jules said, I think you need, I had gotten the master's at UMass, but not the doctorate. You come on down to Southern and we'll organize some things. So I went back to Southern to teach. And then I started teaching a course at the University of New Orleans. And one young lady was talking this morning about being the first. Well, the political science department at the University of New Orleans, it was a new university, was from LSU, started out as LSU New Orleans and became the University of New Orleans. And, and I was the first person to get a degree from that department. And the point I want to make is how it was written up. They didn't say black person. They said no color associated. Woman gets the first degree. So anybody who read the paper or whatever would not know that that woman was black, because they had had that department for a few years, and there were white students, black students, males and females, and I was the first to get the degree. But of course, I was a little bit older than they, let me see, about 26. 27. And maybe I was a little bit more motivated, but I got that degree. But my research has focused on development, education, gender in the developing world, and gender and race in the US. And I put it in the context of imperialism, because imperialism is and always has been global. Empires, sun never sets on the British Empire, you know, the Holy Roman Empire, Egyptian Empire, all of them, it has always been global. They want control over, they steal or they seize territory, resources, natural, human, financial resources. They enact treaties and laws and all of that kind of stuff to facilitate their exploitation and oppression. So imperialism, as we normally think of it, is domination by brute force. It is a finite manifestation of imperialism. But the most insidious and the most dangerous aspect of imperialism is cultural imperialism. Cultural imperialism is what gives you the mind shackles through the media, through the education system, through the religious systems, through the political system, through communications especially. They imprint, they embed codes, and those codes imprint dominant and subservient roles for different people. The whites get the dominant roles, we get the subservient roles. And ideologies. And these roles and ideologies come out mostly as racism, patriarchy, and class domination. And so what I mean to say today is that racism is imperialism. Patriarchy or sexism is imperialism, if you think about it. Religious dogma is imperialism. Even the hierarchy of nations, like, you know, the members of the Security Council in the UN, they want to determine what the other nations of the world do. That's imperialism. There are so many forms of imperialism that are cultural imperialism that we don't notice it. Sometimes it's subtle. Many times it's subliminal. But sometimes it's in your face. But we take that in. We integrate it, so many of us. I mean, if you think about it, in a world that is so globally connected, it is much easier to do that. You can rule without bringing in the armies. That's what they do. They control your mind. Mind shackles is what I call it. And Donald Trump's followers are products of cultural imperialism. They rally to the three themes that he spouts. And he has three themes. If you think about what Donald Trump says, one theme is white supremacy. The second theme is sexism. And the third theme is American exceptionalism. And where is, Latoya has a piece in a book that I did, and she talks about American exceptionalism in there, Tanya Williams. Read that and see what American exceptionalism is all about. In other words, we are in fact entitled to be the first nation in the world. And if there are trade deficits, somebody else should have it, not us. It's rigged if we are not. It's that kind of exceptionalism. We can do what we want to prisoners, but don't do anything to an American prisoner. Yeah, it's American exceptionalism, it's racism, it's sexism. And the codes are there. And those white males, who are primarily the ones who follow, hear those codes And they know what they are doing. Donald Trump is saying we're going to take back our nation. In other words, should be a white nation, and we're going to take it back. And when he belittles women, he is saying we're also going to take back our control and domination over women as well. So you put those three codes, and we are in a world of trouble for Donald Trump coming in. But I'll just make one more statement, and I know, I understand. Jewel Prestige used to tell me, Shelby, you make your statements, but don't be judgmental of other people's statements. So I'm pretty firm about what I say. But that doesn't mean I think I'm the only one who has those words. Your views are just as important as mine, and I respect them. But doesn't mean I'm not going to make a forceful case. And I was going to say it yesterday, but I just very quickly. In 1982, I believe it was, the American Political Science Association gave a grant to the women on the Committee on the Status of Women to do a book, start research on the women's movement. And I was added to that group. Well, my views on what has happened for women was very different from what some of the others on that committee thought. I mean, they're gonna start the women's movement with Seneca Falls. What happened to all of the stuff that we had done and the people here had done, you know, in California, the ones who were up, and all over the world? And I'm saying no. And then they had a paradigm about what the struggle was all about. Bottom line, they were going to put me on to do the introduction and another section. Well, when I wrote my other section, I challenged their paradigm. And the title of my paper there, and I never remember what I do, so I have my CV here. The title of the piece that I wrote was A Liberation Ideology, the Intersection of Race, Sex, and Class. Now, that was printed by that committee, but then in 1988, and I was supposed to be the co-editor. In 1988, they came out with another version, and the woman who was the other editor was the only editor. And this position that I was trying to put forth, they called it an epilogue. So the point I'm making is I did not agree with the definition of the women's movement that they had, their paradigm. I wrote my own. They didn't like it, but they couldn't, my information in the introduction would justify it. They have in the table of contents, introduction by Shelby Lewis. There's no introduction in the book. Now that's just evading. So when you start talking about women and the women's movement, I've been involved in all kinds of activities in different places all over the world, and people have their own definitions, their own stories, their own experiences, and we talk about them. I wrote a piece called Africana Feminism. I started the Africana Women's Studies program. And people say, why is it called Africana Women's Studies? I said, because it's the comparative study of women of African descent. African Americans, people in Latin America and the Caribbean, and people in Africa. Now, I have learned that we are going to have to expand that because the slave trade was not just here. It was in the East as well. And we've got lots of women. I was at a conference in Senegal, and there were these daughters of slaves who came out of Istanbul. They were slaves. Slavery was in that area before it was coming to the West. And we have started doing some of that diasporan studies. And so I have learned that we've got to extend it. I'm not there to extend the program, but I have learned the lesson. And I have learned a lot of good lessons here. And so I appreciate the fact that Tiffany gave me a little more time. I'd certainly appreciate it. But there's no way to go through 6 decades of research in a few minutes.
That's correct.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So to quote Jessica Millward from earlier, so Tiffany, you put me on after Shelby Lewis, right? Okay, thanks.
It's because
Thank
I
you.
see you as doing the thing she's doing.
So I wrote something because otherwise I feared that I would take too much time. So I'm going to read this. On January 23rd, 1977, Roots debuted on ABC TV. I watched the show with my family in a Cleveland suburb. It was watched by some 65% of U.S. households. It made an impression on my 8-year-old self, both for what it explained and what it did not. It did explain why white people routinely insulted my family on the street. It explained why people assumed that my white mom was my foster mom. But it did not explain why my father lost his black law partner when he married my white mother, or why our entire black social circle disappeared when my father died. On Memorial Day 2016, an updated Roots, the miniseries with Forrest Whitaker and Lawrence Fishburne, will debut on the History Channel. So this is done in 4 parts. In 2012, George Zimmerman shot and killed an unarmed Trayvon Martin. On Thursday, May 12th, Zimmerman auctioned off the gun that shot and killed Trayvon Martin. He received bids as high as $65 million, but the auction was closed down because there was lots of fraudulent activity. On June 16, 2015, Donald Trump announced his candidacy to be the Republican nominee for president, saying, quote, "When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best, they're not sending you," by which he meant the white people in the audience. "They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists." As an afterthought, he added, "and some, I assume, are good people," unquote. 6 months later, on December 8th, 6 days after the San Bernardino shootings by a US-born citizen and a permanent legal resident, Trump called for a, quote, "total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what is going on," unquote. Ted Cruz, his major rival, apparently unaware that Muslims do not live on reservations or in internment camps or in banlieues like in France, called for heightened policing of Muslim neighborhoods. Thank you. After a long primary fight, Trump is soon to be the official Republican nominee for president. My sons were born in a country with the first black president. They are now 5 and 7, respectively, and have already been threatened multiple times with suspension and expulsion. Part 2. I'm not a political scientist. I've spent my entire academic career trying to make sense, though, of the cultural politics that shape our aggressively white supremacist, anti-black racial landscape. I received my BA in English at Columbia University before going to Yale's American Studies department. And I've always been in an interdisciplinary context. Every single position I've held up to my current one has been a joint appointment, and I've always also been in a comparative context. I've never considered black Americans in isolation, not because it was expected of me or someone was pressuring me to do it, but because it made the most sense to me. My first book, Soul Power, looked at a group that I called US Third World Leftists. The book made 3 interventions. For one, I argued that understanding the full breadth and intellectual and political sophistication of the modern civil rights movement requires us to consider the profound influence of Third World anti-colonialists, Mao, Fanon, Cabral, Castro. In fact, I wrote a chapter on black thinkers going to Cuba in 1959, so it was nice to hear that. And Western Marxists on black and brown filmmakers, writers, and activists in the 1960s and 1970s. Secondly, I argued that our understanding of what does or does not count as political, what is or is not considered political organizing, what is or is not considered political critique, cannot explain on-the-ground conditions of oppressed people. In the female hospital workers in 1199, many of them who were Puerto Rican or from the Caribbean or from the southern United States, I saw women who understood that their poverty wages were connected to their inability to sit on public transport where they chose. It was connected to their life in squalid tenements owned by slumlords. It was connected to the fact that their kids went to substandard schools where their skin color or their accent was the excuse for their mistreatment and miseducation. These black and brown women understood that their social and political circumstances may not have been identical to one another, but the result was the same: low wages, crappy housing, disrespect on the job and in the streets, and they fought to change that. Finally, I argued that the films, poems, songs, essays, and plays that U.S. Third World leftists made about other U.S. Third World leftists, about the hospital workers, the squatters, the prisoners, were a powerful form of political engagement and critique. Cultural production brought people together, it made them laugh or cry, and it told them stories about themselves that were both tragic and uplifting, and it inspired them to fight their work and life conditions. It centered the voices of black and brown women when the public image of the civil rights movement was so intent on portraying it as often male and middle class. Part 3. My current project again takes on an interdisciplinary and comparative framework to look at race and popular culture after 9/11. The book is called Culture Wars, Terror Wars, soon to be finished, and it makes two primary interventions. For one, I consider how a dynamic of black idealization, so think Obama, Shonda Rhimes, black sports and entertainment figures, and black objection, the unceasing police murder of black people, exists in relation to the increasing state violence aimed at Latino and Latinas and Muslim immigrants. I argue that forms of state violence were road-tested on black people before then being aimed at, and simultaneously with being aimed at, Latino and Latinas and Muslim immigrants. I think we can only fully grasp these dynamics, how powerful state violence is and how multifaceted it is when we look relationally. For example, the rate of police murder of unarmed black men is not the highest in the country. In fact, it's surpassed by the rate of police murder of unarmed Native peoples. If you go to the website mappingpoliceviolence.org, it erroneously repeats the idea that black people are murdered at the highest rate because it compares us to white people. And that's true if you compare us to white people. But Native people are the most likely to be murdered by police. They're only 0.8% of the population, and they make up 1.9% of all police killings. Albuquerque, in fact, which is where I come from, it's the second most police killing city, I guess you would call it. Secondly, I look at the ways in which the civil rights legacy has been twisted and repurposed for the uses of white supremacy. It's one of the reasons I really appreciate being here, because I've been like deep in the muck of Trump and white supremacists. So it's nice to be in a space that is so both supportive and affirming and positive in a lot of different ways. The discourse of disenfranchisement, though, I think, borrowed by Trump and his ilk, is just one example of a larger dynamic at work, and that is that Martin Luther King Jr. himself has been reappropriated as, first of all, the kind of solitary symbol of the civil rights movement, but also he's become a kind of favorite icon of the white right, and in particular the Tea Party. A black woman, Katrina Pearson, is the national spokesperson for Trump, right? So she was out there talking about how it didn't matter that David Duke was his supporter, I guess you'd call her. And I think these things are neither coincidental nor unimportant. Part 4. My work has been part of a wave of scholars interested in transnational flows of people and ideas. It's been part of a wave of scholarship interested in rethinking how cultural production and politics intersect with one another, and it's been part of a wave of scholarship that looks both intersectionally and relationally at race. Most importantly, perhaps, I've been part of a wave of scholarship that has signaled the end of the, in quotes, innocent black subject, unquote. In an era where Obama has both expanded his drone program, killing civilians in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia, those are just the top 5, He's also declared the rights of transgender people to use the bathrooms they choose, right? So we have these two things coexisting. And I think making sense of and stopping this kind of paradoxical state where you have rights for some and you have death for others is the urgent anti-imperial work of our time. Thank you.
You ready? Okay. So I'm giving a PowerPoint, that's why I'm waiting. Okay, well, I will start talking, and once it pops up, that's fine. So I'm Gladys Mitchel-Walthour. I am in the Department of Africology, which is basically Africana Studies at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. The first slide I have, I'm not going to go over, is mainly for the graduate students to see kind of my academic / career trajectory, just so that you know that it's okay when you finish your PhD if you don't first have a tenure track job, right? So I had, postdocs and had a tenure track job. It was not a good fit. And then I ended up getting a visiting scholar fellowship, which was not a postdoc. It was a visiting scholar fellowship. So most people were already tenured. And then I got this great opportunity as a visiting assistant professor at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. So again, that's just to kind of let the grad students know that it's okay if when you finish, you don't go straight into a tenure track job. Okay. So my work is on Afro-Brazilian racial politics. So I just want to give a little background. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but Brazil is second to Nigeria as having the largest population of African descendants. 4.86 million enslaved Africans went to Brazil. Approximately 450,000 went to the United States. Brazil has 48 million Afro-Brazilian women. Brazil is not a racial paradise, and racial democracy is a myth. So we can always talk more about that, but the Brazilian police have killed more than 11,000 people between 2009 and 2013 for an average of 6 killings a day. According to the São Paulo-based Brazilian Forum on Public Safety, police nationwide killed 11,197 people over the past 5 years, whereas in the United States, law enforcement agents killed 11,090 people over the past 30 years. So that's just to let you have an idea about Brazil as compared to the United States. The next thing, and it's unfortunate that this isn't working, but can you raise your hand if you know Cláudia da Silva Ferreira? I know one person. Okay. So Cláudia Ferreira was 38 years old, a mother of 4, Afro-Brazilian, from Morro da Congonha in Rio, and she was killed by police. So in preparation for the Olympics and World Cup, police, they go into low-income neighborhoods, which are normally Afro-Brazilian, and they start killing people. And they say that, that they're pacifying the communities of the criminal elements, and so they killed her. And then they put her body in the back of the police trunk. Her body fell out and was dragged for 1,000 feet. Someone caught this on camera. And then they just stuffed her back in the car. And so this is how she was treated. So that's our Brazilian racial paradise. The reason I think this is so important And I'm so happy to be on this panel because obviously this panel, we're already doing the type of work that I think is so important. So that when we are doing work on Black people or Black women, we need to remember that there are Black people in other places. And that the same thing that is happening here in the US happens in other places. It's important for us not to ignore the experiences of Black people in other places. So this is just for the grad students. You can look at it quickly. And then this is the picture of Claudia Fajeda. So this is actually a clip, so I'm just showing this. This was showed, or you can watch this online on Al Jazeera. Nia Hampton is a young African-American woman who was in Salvador Bahia, and
They've stopped Al Jazeera.
yeah. So this is actually in Salvador Bahia, and it's a painting or mural of Michael Brown and Freddie Gray. So this is important to me because you can see here that Brazilians know what's going on in here. But do we know Claudia Fajeda? It's important for us to know that. Otherwise, we get so, we think that all of these issues of white supremacy, sexism, transphobia, homophobia is limited to the US, and we're blind to hegemonic global white supremacy, global sexism, homophobia. And this is in English, right? So we can't say that language is a barrier and things like that. No, you can Google this right now. This is important. So Dilma Rousseff, Brazil's president, was impeached. She was part of the Workers' Party, and so she supported a lot of very progressive policies. Social policies such as Bolsa Familia that have lifted millions out of poverty, that President Lula, also from the same party, supported. They have also supported quota programs for Blacks and Browns in universities. Dilma Rousseff actually passed legislation in 2012 that public federal universities have to enact quotas. And those are the free universities, which are the best universities in Brazil. The reason I'm showing Ironeldes Carvalho, or as she's called, Tia Heron, is because she voted against Dilma. Let me see if I can. Okay, so this is what she said. So I watched this, but this is like her face. She had a Facebook post, and then this blog, they're talking about her Facebook post. And she said, "I am the voice of Black women from the Northeast." The Northeast is mainly Afro-Brazilian. That don't want the crumbs of the federal government because we have dignity to work and to overcome. So very conservative rhetoric, and she's from a conservative political party. The reason this is so important to me is that we can't think that just because someone is Black that they have our interest at hand. And you can see this is a Black woman, and then she used that type of language, and she's really talking about this program I just told you about, Bolsa Familia. Okay, I have to speed up. These are just some of my major findings from my past work. I'm not going to go through all of these. You can always just, I have a website, gmwphd.com, so you can always read that. gmwphd.com. These are just some of the fields that my research touches. So I'm a political scientist. But I'm very happy to be in a Black Studies department. So political science, Latin American studies, Brazilian studies, African diaspora studies. Those are my audience. And then here I just have a list of people that actually do intersectional work in the context of Brazil. So the only person I could think of who actually solely focuses on Afro-Brazilian women is Jara Harrington as a political scientist. people in other fields do this all the time. And so most of these people are anthropologists and sociologists, but Jara Harrington is the only one I could think of to date who actually does work solely on Afro-Brazilian women. She finished University of Chicago in 2015, is now a postdoc at Wake Forest. So these first two books are co-edited volumes. The gray one came out in 2016, Race and the Politics of Knowledge Production.
Next slide.
This one, okay. Oh, sorry, yeah, I forgot to coordinate. But this one is great because we have Afro-Brazilians talking about their experiences doing work in the United States and African-Americans talking about their experiences doing work in Brazil. So this is just a picture of the contributors. We did ask men, but in the end, we just got two, which was fine. It's an excellent book. And then okay, can you go back to the book one? Thank you. So this one, The Politics of Blackness, Theorizing Racial Identity and Political Behavior in Contemporary Brazil. This is my current book that is under contract at Cambridge University Press. So I'm actually revising that book, so I really don't want to talk about it right now. I'm really trying to use an intersectional approach at theorizing how Afro-Brazilians talk about political underrepresentation. And then the fourth project, which hopefully will be a book, will actually be on Afro-Brazilian women recipients of Bolsa Familia. I actually have two Afro-Brazilian students, one a grad student, one an undergrad about to graduate, who are doing these interviews like right now. So one in Rio and one in Uberlândia. And I really want to know, because I'm really, really concerned at this moment, given the conservative turn that Brazil has taken, what is going to be the impact on Afro-Brazilian women? You know, for another government may not be so committed to this social program. So that's another project that I'm thinking about. Oh yeah, okay, can you just flip to? Okay, so this was actually from like a Facebook post from the 2014 election. Got it, thank you. And it says, Dilma won. For a minute, I thought that I would have to work. So, and of course, they put an Afro-Brazilian woman and her children on it, and she's a Bolsa Familia recipient. So this is extremely racist, right? And of course, for the Americans, we know this sounds all too familiar, right? So basically, kind of creating the welfare queen discourse in Brazil is really, really scary. And that's it out in there. Thank you.
So I guess it's my turn, huh? Oh, really? Okay, so I'm not sure why I'm here, but Shelby has shared some of my background with you, and I would just say that when the integration came, I was a senior in high school, and of course I was put out for most of my senior year, which was okay because I was raising hell about what they were doing, and actually did not, my mother really kept us out of school most of the time because we had been assigned, my youngest sister and I, to the white school because we were supposed to be smart. And my mother's position was, no, if the other kids, black kids can't go, they won't go either. So, and then eventually that worked out. We went to school, but I got into a fight the first day. So that was the end of that. So, yeah, and probably, huh? Well, I tried. So the other thing I would say, and I didn't realize until today, in addition to Shelby and I sharing the center of the universe as our homes, I actually lived in the city limits, which in the town limits. That even our trajectories in terms of our careers are very similar. I too went to Southern University. At the age of 19, I had graduated and was actually had received both my undergrad and my master's degree, and was teaching at Southern, not because I was very bright, but because I had this kind of crazy, weird work ethic. And so I don't in any way put myself in the same intellectual category as Shelby, but it just happened that we came from the same village and our careers have been very similar, but I didn't really put that together and we worked together. She was my boss. You can imagine how that went, right? Two strong, very strong personalities, but we worked well together in spite of sometimes we would disagree with each other. We never stopped speaking to each other, so that was a good thing. My interest in international really was fueled in high school. When I was in high school, and this was after Shelby, they probably didn't do this when she was there. The state of Louisiana required that every student be taught 6 weeks of communism versus democracy. And even at the universities, when I first went to Southern in 1971, there was a mandated 1-hour credit course. Fortunately, my first year in college, they did away with that. But as you can imagine, what we were exposed to was very one-sided. You know, stuff like, we had to do portfolios and say communism is hard, and so and read, and so we'd have these, it was awful, awful. But at any rate, so that piqued my curiosity about who are these people? What are they talking about? So when I got to Southern and decided to major in political science eventually, I had an African politics class with Gloria Braxton. And so, of course, we were talking about the African liberation movement, and as many of you know, the Soviets and Chinese, although it was some imperialism, were very instrumental in terms of funding some of those liberation movements. So I always had this fascination about going to the Soviet Union. And I eventually got to the Soviet Union. So that kind of fueled my interest. So what I've experienced in terms of my career is that because of my interest in Soviet and Eastern European politics, and the circles I traveled in terms of the International Studies Association, the Slavic Studies Association, these white men would always ask me, why are you here? Why are you interested in this? Or the assumption is, oh, she does African politics or, you know, black politics. And I was like, no, I don't know anything about those. And so I've always, always had, you know, these questions around this black female being interested in Soviet and Eastern European or communist politics or whatever. So that was a bit of a challenge. Because usually at conferences and stuff, my name would appear as Kathy Stromile-Golden. So what did they think? Here's a German Jew. And so when I would show up with this nappy hair, they were like, and so those, even at the University of Kentucky, I had a choice of going to Kentucky or Purdue. So I chose Kentucky. Why, I really don't know, but I chose Kentucky. And so when I got there, you know, it was like, wow, who is this person? So there was this ignoring. I was visible except for one person, a white male of Swedish descent, who, you know, who became my major advisor. But the idea, and so people would say stuff like, oh, She has her degrees from black schools. She probably needs to start all over again. You know, just craziness. And did everything they could to get me out of the department. I refused to leave, so the secretary, after the first semester, said, well, I'm giving you a key to the Xerox room and the mailbox, because it's clear you're not going anywhere. I said, exactly. I'll go when I get ready. So that's the kind of foolishness that I had to put up with. But so my research then has mostly been on media coverage in the, well, that was, you know, before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So media coverage in the Soviet system, so, or the Warsaw Pact. And since that time, I've focused on ethnic conflict in post-communist systems. And of course, a lot of that interest is fueled by ethnic conflict in this country. And so we see some of the same things occurring. But in addition to that, like Shelby, I've worked outside of academia. Shelby was instrumental in the United Negro College Fund, starting its kind of international program. And so she called me to work with her there, and we had projects and probably connecting HBCUs to like 32 countries, 32 projects around the world, in addition to having the South African Tertiary Education Project. So in doing that work, in terms of linking HBCUs with higher educations in I can't see, okay. So I've done some work focused on women, looking at a literacy project in Liberia, post-war Liberia, which is very similar to some work I do in Mississippi with the Southern Regional Black Women's Initiative that focuses on black women, empowering black women in the Black Belt of Alabama, Georgia, and counties in the Delta in Mississippi. So there are 77 counties that we work with women of color, black women. These projects, these women, we pumped in something like over $12 million into these communities for projects that are run by black women, like commercial kitchens, sewing cooperative, agricultural cooperatives, and these women are able to support themselves, their families, provide transportation in areas where there's no transportation. We look in those projects, we look at it through a multi-generational and an intersectional lens that explores the connection between race, poverty, and geographical location. We've been doing this work about 10 years. We've also connected this work with the Dalit women in India who have some similar challenges and who have been able to overcome those challenges in terms of building cooperatives. They have an extensive medical network where those marginalized women and their families are able to get the medical attention that they need, and they have other kinds of enterprises that have been able to sustain the community, and the governments are not doing anything. You know, it's their way of empowering themselves, their children, and even sometimes their spouses. But so that's where I come from. I don't do women in politics. I told David Wilson, I said, David, I'm going to this conference, and you know, probably I'm too long on common sense and too short on the lingo that these women use. And he says, look, be patient and don't use any 3- and 4-letter words. So I have done that, right, Tanya? David would be proud.
I trust me, we're in charge, it's okay. All right, so I'm from Detroit, and I had the good fortune to grow up in a household with people who had really vastly different political ideologies. So on my mother's side of the family, they had been doing civil rights activism primarily around housing and the rights of migrants, poor migrants to the north for 40 or 50 years. On my stepfather's side, they had been doing different kinds of work that included mostly around stuff around internationalism, right? My stepfather was born in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and did a PhD at the Sorbonne, and then met a whole group of other internationalist people who were really interested in the Black Power movement, who wanted to move to Detroit and found the Black College. And so the conversations they would have and the kind of way that intimacy and marriage helped them mediate, or the way their marriage was made through these deep contestations over what Black politics is or was or could be, was the place that I was raised. And so that was a really powerful kind of experience, really of watching what people can do who want to fight about it as opposed to problem solve. And so I consider those wounds and those conflicts as the best kind of training ground ever, I also grew up in Detroit with people who were deeply, deeply, deeply attentive to the politics of publishing. So it wasn't until this past summer when someone invited me to write an encyclopedia article where I started to learn how deep the politics of publishing and broadcasting and using journalism as a site of political education. I didn't really understand. I'd kind of just taken it for granted. Of course there would be 2 or 3 Black newspapers that were published through our church. Of course there would be South African dissidents who were the ministers at our church. Of course, didn't everybody grow up like that? Didn't everybody know more about South Africa than about the rest of the state they lived in? No, not at all. But that was in fact my experience. This kind of Black liberation theology, Black internationalism was just basic to my experience. It was what I thought it meant to be a Black person, was to be able to talk about Steve Biko. That's just what I thought was the world was. And I'm grateful to those people and their kinds of questions that they wanted to ask, and the sensibility that they had for us, that we needed to be able to understand the local and be very deeply involved in the local, but not be constrained by the local and whatever the local might mean. Okay, so I went to South Africa for the first time in 1999, and there, I thought I was going to do research on Black unions, and I found out about something called the Inspectorate of White Labor, which, get this, was literally a government agency that was established to displace Black people who were working in industrialized sector with poor white people, and to reclassify the jobs that those Black people had as white jobs or as civilized labor jobs. So that meant all the Black people then had to have a lower classification of work, even though they had the jobs and had the skills, and they'd have to be paid lower so the white people could be paid more than them. And I was taken by this. I said, wow, a whole government was involved in this? This is so fascinating. So I started just looking at the government processes and commissions around this. And then I realized that the Carnegie Foundation, like Human Peace and Freedom, blah, 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 all of that stuff, had actually contributed to this as well. And they produced a 5-volume study that they paid and sent all around the world to scholars about the problem of white poverty and the hysteria of, how we need to protect poor white people, because we don't want them interacting with Black people. We don't want them coming to understand themselves as having any kind of relationship to Black workers. If there's going to be workers in a society that has a racial labor hierarchy, it's going to be white people. Black people are slaves. They're not going to be workers. White people will be workers. So even to be able to have the status to be designated as a worker was not something that Black people were supposed to have. What I found was that the Carnegie Foundation was deeply involved in trying to preserve white racial hierarchy, white minority rule, and to use the existence, just whether you have white people that are working class and poor, and in Algeria you call them pieds noirs, or in the Caribbean they're called red legs, to use the fact of white poverty that just didn't exist to justify the need for white minority rule and suppression and more extensive domination of black people. That's the relationship that I found, and that's what I wrote my book about. The things that I work on and try to work on have to do with the significance of internationalism, which is why I love Cynthia's work so much and why Soul Power has been so influential and so meaningful for me. Internationalism is one of the responses to black people being caged within the nation state and being told that the way that you can respond to your situation, whether it's in Brazil or if it's Colombia or it's Venezuela, is to pursue remedy and legal constitutional remedies within the nation state alone. And that's just not something I believe in. I don't believe in that. I don't believe in it. I'm gonna make the time. I'm gonna make the time. I've spent a lot of time writing about race and knowledge production. I've spent a lot of time writing about the dangers of expertise, because that's a very, very big piece of knowledge production, and the way that expertise de-skills everyday people from coming together to solve problems that are meaningful for themselves. I've written a little bit about visual culture and the way that visual culture is connected to this notion of post-racialism. And post-racialism is not a new phenomenon. For those of you who do work in the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, post-racialism is actually a very old form of dominance and creating a world where there's the people who are ruled and the people who are rulers. Right? If you look at whitening or immigration restriction or blackbirding, which was the extension of the slave trade after 1865 all over the Americas and outside of the Americas, what you see actually is that post-racialism, or the attempt to bring in a white population and to prohibit a black population, to bring in an Indian, South Asian population, or to bring in an East Asian population in order to make your society look a certain kind of way. This amalgamation scheme, to use Jared Sexton's language, it is not new. It is not new. And so in my work, I've also tried to give histories of post-racialism that compel us to think about this moment in time through a lens of the Americas, right? If you study Fiji, if you study New Zealand, all of a sudden, you study the making of what Gerald Horne calls the white Pacific, all of a sudden you can't think of post-racialism as a brand new thing, that's a new racial technology that somebody came up. The last thing I want to share with you all is that when I was 11 years old, my grandmother gave me a book, Rose Butler Brown's memoir about her life. Some of you have heard of Rose Butler Brown. It's called Love My Children. And it's about a black woman who attended one of the Rosenwald, is that right, fund schools in the South. And she did some of her doctoral research on the Montessori educational framework and went to Harvard and graduated from Harvard, and then went back to the South and began to teach teachers how to introduce Montessori kinds of frameworks into the classroom, right? Kind of open classrooms, less dictatorial kinds of classrooms. Another thing that I learned from reading that book, I was a little itty-bitty, teeny-tiny person, right? Reading this big, big book about how philanthropy produces knowledge makers and produces the whole field of knowledge. But another thing that I learned from that book is that she and her husband, they used their household as a cultural remittance for this community. They didn't have dormitories, they just had all their students living with them. And so I read this book that my grandmother gave me, and it gave me an image of a black woman in the world that could answer the call or vocation, but really the call to teach in a kind of way that was very collectivist, in a kind of way that was really, really attentive to culture, in the way that you have these practices of culture that enable people to really move in the world. And so that's really the last thing I want to share about my work. But the publishing piece, The publishing piece is so important. A lot of people have mentioned the politics of citationality and how important it is to cite. And I know oftentimes journals will prohibit you from citing the fullness of your genealogy. They'll say, oh, really, we don't have room, you got 8,000 words, you can only cite 2 people. And I try to get around it by, trying to write a genealogy of a whole subfield with 25 things in a footnote, because I don't know who's going to be able to read the work later. I don't know what kind of resources or what kind of institution they're going to be at, but I want to give them any reader, as many pebbles as possible, so that they can go back and recreate the world. They can build the university again if they can't get a chance to talk to me. Please don't be precious with your work. This is really, I'm thinking now of the students, but even for those of us who've written a lot, let it go. Let it go. Share the things that you're working on. Talk to people about the things that you're working on, and give them to the people who are not at the university. Put them into the hands. I mean, you got to follow the lesson that they have in places like Harlem, where you can go and you can get, Dr. Ben's book on 125th Street. You can, in Tijuana, you can get to a book table, and the book I just wrote is right there. You're like, wow, it's not in Barnes and Noble, it's in Tijuana. That's excellent. I had a chance to speak with the founder of Africa World Press last year in the fall. Actually, it was APSA, it was on the East Coast last year, right? Was it APSA? Was it? Anyway, I was at APSA, and Abebe Zagaya made space for me, made an introduction so I could go and meet the gentleman, and Shakol, Kasahun Shakol. And you know what he said to me? He said, we never ran this business in the red, not 1 year, not ever. He said, Africa World Press has been successful always, he said, because we always went to the community first with whatever book we had. We sold them in mosques, and we sold them in churches, and we sold them at hip-hop concerts, and we sold them at high schools. He said, we have never had a problem. And naive me, right? Because even though all the stuff I know about how racial gender consciousness is so deeply entrenched in Black thought, I said to him, oh, well, do you have anything on women? I thought I was giving him a real zinger. I thought I was going to catch him. because I didn't know their book list, right? It's like being at the libraries at Timbuktu to go into his warehouse, and then he just shows me the walls and walls and walls of books on African women. He said, this is our second volume on Amata Aidu, just on Amata Aidu, and it's a 600-page thing, Key thoughts on Amata Aidu. And he wasn't even nasty about it. He just was like, of course we have that. And he said our main place that we sell is actually really not here in the U.S. It's in Africa. It's in the Caribbean, right? It's in Europe. Because people are not afraid to put things on their syllabi. They're not afraid to say, you know what? There's about 12 more books that you're going to need to get to be able to get through this class. So I'll leave it there. I think you hear my heart. So we're going to have a moment to have maybe 1 or 2 questions for the panel. Could be comments. Kim.